So I will just briefly introduce our speakers. We're going to have commentary from two experts, and then Rowan will respond, and then we will open it up for discussion, and then we welcome you to raise a glass of wine, or not wine, if you so choose, afterwards.
Doris, are you able to mute? I'm about to ask if we could ask our virtual attendees to please mute. I'm unable to kind of go in for whatever reason and mute people's.
That sounds promising.
Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. Okay, so brief introductions. There is an awful lot more that could be said about each of these people, but we're going to keep it short and sweet. Rowan Dorin is assistant professor of history here at Stanford, where he's also a member of the core faculty of the Berkeley Center for Jewish Studies and an affiliate of several other centers and programs. His favorite being, of course, the Center for Law and History, and I swear those are his words, not mine. He came to Stanford in 2017 after spending a whopping 13 years at an unnamed institution out east, let's call it Harvard, where he earned his AB and PhD, and where he's also a junior fellow of the Society of Fellows. As you can see from his new book, his research interests encompass medieval legal history, economic history, Jewish-Christian relations, manuscript studies, and digital humanities. Our first speaker is going to be Jessica Goldberg, who's also very graciously offered to give a little kind of précis of the book for those who have not had a chance to read it yet. She's an associate professor of history at the University of California, Los Angeles, and previously taught at University of Pennsylvania and Stanford. A specialist in the economic and legal history of the Mediterranean Basin, Latin Christendom, and the Western Islamic world, Professor Goldberg earned widespread acclaim for a path-breaking 2012 study, Trade and Institutions in the Medieval Mediterranean, the Geniza Merchants, and Their Business World. Professor Goldberg has published articles on the legal cultures of both Latin Christian Europe and the Islamic world, and many other topics, and she's currently working on two projects, finishing a documentary history of the role of merchants in the Egyptian rural economy, and starting work on the revolution in material culture that divides late antiquity from the early medieval world. And last but definitely not least, we have Laurent Mayali, who is the Robbins Professor of Law at Berkeley, where he also serves as faculty director of the Comparative Legal Studies program and is, of course, director of the renowned Robbins Collection of Religious and Civil Law, a longtime mecca for legal historians. Since 1997, he also holds a chair in Roman Christianity and the sources of modern law at the École Pratique des Hautes Études in the Sorbonne. In addition to 24 monographs, edited volumes, and handbooks, Professor Mayali has also published more than 75 articles on topics ranging from every aspect of Roman and medieval law and many areas of comparative modern law as well, particularly regarding Korea and Japan. So, thanks so much, and with that, Professor Goldberg.
Hi, thank you all for having me, and I, of course, want to thank Rowan most of all for an incredibly stimulating, but also, as expected from Rowan, clear-minded, extraordinarily responsible book on the understudied nexus between expulsions of Jews and expulsions and canon law around Christian usury in medieval Europe. And I am going to apologize first because when a book is truly responsible, trying to summarize it is of course going to muddle some of the clarity and the fine detail of the argument, which is part of what is most worthy of appreciation in this book, but I'm going to do my best. Also, I will say that I was not sure exactly, whether this would be a law audience or a medieval history audience. So if I say things that are incredibly obvious to everybody or that nobody knows, I also apologize. I tried to pitch my summary where I could. Okay, so one of the things that sort of lies in the background of this book is the sort of what we might call the narrative of medieval Jewry in Europe, Western Europe, right? And very much, we could say that this is written against the backdrop of what we could call the lachrymose narrative. And if you had a chance to read this book, you will understand some of the reasons that there is a lachrymose narrative. This really, you get a lot of the detail of why there is a Jewish tendency to write this history as a history of increasing repression. And that the touchstones of this narrative that are of concern in this book are the two late 12th century expulsions of Jews. The first, the French expulsion of 1182, and then the 1190 anti-Jewish riots and violence in England that followed, and the local expulsions that followed, both of which are brief. The 1290 expulsion from England, which proves permanent, and we'll say permanent meaning through the Middle Ages. The 1306 first expulsion from France that will mostly become permanent, and culminating in the 1492 expulsion from Spain, which involves a much, much larger Jewish population and is also permanent. And one of the things that we want to start with are the two insights that Rowan really brings to the reinterpretation of this narrative. And the first insight is that expulsion really doesn't have precedence in Western European history. It also doesn't really have much of a legal basis in a society where legal justification is often actually quite ideologically important to rulers. Subpoints of this, there's really only two kinds of regional and national expulsion that happen in medieval Latin Christendom, and those two are deeply entwined, and they involve the Lombards, who are the ethnically defined foreign moneylenders who mostly come from northern Italy, what we would say is modern day Lombardy, Tuscany, and a tiny corner of Umbria, and then the Jews. And the other part of this insight is that Latin Christians have a lot of hatred for Jews, and there's a lot of anti-Jewish violence that has a number of different inciting factors. Ideas of territorial purification against the infidels or enemies of Christ, accusations of ritual murder, accusations of host desecration, accusations of well poisoning, particularly around the transmission of the Black Death. But despite all of these different forms of anti-Jewish hatred, the territorial expulsions of Jews are justified almost entirely by a language developed to explain a need to expel Christian usurers from the land. And caveat to that, the Spanish expulsion of 1492 is quite different and does not actually only involves tiny corners of the same logic. The second and incredibly important insight methodologically that Rowan brings to this table is that we really can't understand the actual expulsions without looking at the larger legal and religious context. The grounds for expulsion, the ideas of who made legitimate targets, the very important difference between ideological claims versus actions, and also an enormous amount of inaction and active resistance to these calls. And this is absolutely an unbelievably massive research effort that Rowan's book is incredibly modest about. So I feel like we really need to point that out. It is very hard to research a negative. And so that is a great deal of the importance of this book. So with that, sort of the brief historical story that we're getting is group expulsion is a new thing in 12th century Western Europe. Expulsion as a punishment itself is new, as opposed to temporary exile, which is usually individual, or banishment from a local community. But the idea of legally expelling a group defined largely in ethnic or ethno-religious terms is particularly new. And in addition to that, it only gets invented in two places, northern France or northwestern France, mostly meaning the domains of the French king, particularly sort of the area around Paris, but also eventually to the west, into western France, and England. And it happens in distinct but very distinctly related ways. And so Rowan tells us the two distinct stories of the origin. So the first story is 12th century England, and involves Henry II's expulsions. And Henry II's expulsion is actually, the first expulsion we get is foreign mercenaries. And that's the first precedent that we get. And there is very much contained in this an anti-foreigner purification discourse combined with a monetary issue here, the paying of foreign mercenaries. There's another monetary issue that goes unmentioned, that they are Flemings, and there is a whole problem, economic problem of the relationship of the English and the Flemings, but we're not going to get into that right now. Okay, so in 1190, this is followed by local expulsions of Jews, which is distinct from anti-Jewish violence. It involves a purification discourse and very much the idea of Jews as royal property. That is, we see a real expansion of the idea that will become much more general in Europe. It already existed, but it's becoming more, it's getting as royal power grows, it's getting more and more to become a royal prerogative, not just the prerogative of local rulers. The idea that Jews are protected by kings, but only because they serve the king. So in the 13th century, what we see is that the development of that particular idea around Jews and money, that we have very poor English kings, and they construct the service that they're owed from Jews as monetary payments. And there begins to actually be a threat of expulsion if they can't pay, which is a way of constructing completely native Jewish communities that is very long-standing, all of whom were probably born in English territory as foreigners, but doesn't actually get enforced. But you can see a mindset beginning to develop. And the other part of this is that in the 12th century, there is already a discourse developing around foreigners and money lending. And to some extent, this is because it is a very early period for the development of credit in England, which is pretty late to the scene in the development of credit networks, which means that it's very unregulated, it's a little bit of a Wild West, and it really does, in fact, need to be reined in. And so some of what happens around the 12th century expulsions is that, and this happens also in France, is that there are very brief expulsions, which seem mostly to be demonstrative, and accompanied by intense anxieties around usury, and this leads to more regulation. But it also leads to a much clearer distinction in England between the sinfulness of Christian usury, which is the purview of the church, and the sinfulness of Jewish money lending, which belongs, or the problem of Jewish money lending, which is a problem for the king, because the king is in charge of the Jews and therefore their moral behavior. So what we see here. And the other problem that happens is, again, and I will bring up some of the economic issues later, is that as more foreign merchants and moneylenders arrive in England, with increasing sophistication and organization and political power in associations with the papacy, the connection between money lending and foreignness and merchants becomes really powerful in England, and it becomes very much an impetus. An anti-foreigner discourse develops very much around questions of finance, but also just mercantile activity in general. In fact, brokerage is one of the complaints. Now, in France, we have a slightly different narrative. Again, part of it is we're not really talking about France. We're really talking about Paris and Parisian authority, because in the 12th century, of course, royal power in France is limited to a pretty small circle around Paris. So there is an expulsion in 1182 by the French king, and this is about concerns with usury in general, but it's also an expression of royal power and lineage, as Philip Augustus, who's very much trying to expand the notions of the French monarchy, it's the big project of his reign, he's also expressing that he is in the lineage of Dagobert, who also expelled Jews from his royal domain. So you get a much more of an issue of royal power, and money lending is part of the problem, but again, it's more about regulating rates of interest and bans on certain forms of interest, but making a legal distinction where Jews are legally allowed to loan at specific rates of interest. And of course, in both cases, the rhetoric is changing in the 1220s as Lombards, that is Italians, as opposed to other kind of moneylenders, start to arrive in rather significant numbers in both of these places. So with that sort of background, the real thing, the two things that are most significant happen during the reign of Louis IX, Saint Louis, the great French king, the great crusader, and what we have is before and after Louis IX, there are regulations on usury, there are threats and expulsions of both Jews and Lombards, but they don't have a lot of ideological or moral heft, in part because once the idea of threats of expulsion developed, both French and English rulers before Louis IX are obviously using those threats and expulsions as financial windfalls. And it's not like anyone around them is unaware of this. But Louis IX is a very different kind of ruler. And he really sees personal and political religiosity as one. And he also is very influenced by the growth of the theological school around Paris, and Parisian theologians help set some of the agenda and norms of how he sees financial morality in his kingdom. So what we see is that there is a move away from allowing Jewish usury at all and allowing usury. So first, Louis IX declares that there should be no government enforcement of debts owed to Jews. Although it is still legal for Jews to lend money, the government, which he wants to purify and separate from sinful money making, needs to be removed from that thing that's happening. And then as he prepares to go on crusade, and as he returns from crusade and reflects more on the problems of money and his implication in the kinds of money that he collects, he gets increasingly interested in the idea that the king and his officials should not commit wrongs, but also the idea from the Paris theologians that anyone who profits by association with usury is also a usurer. So what he does is he does not engage in any collective expulsion of the category of Jew or the category of Lombard, but he does threaten them with individual expulsion if they engage in usury, and commands them to instead engage in lawful commerce. Not just that, he doesn't just make a threat, he actually has inquiries into usurious practices, he confiscates assets of usurers, but he doesn't keep the money for himself. He instead gives restitution to borrowers. And again, he also is clear about the limits of his own power. He's only in charge of foreigners and Jews. He respects ecclesiastical authority, local usurers. Again, it's an ecclesiastical affair. It's a sin. It's not a crime. And the king, even if there's excess money after restitution, he doesn't profit. He gives excess monies to religious foundations or crusade. And in 1269, as he prepares for his last crusade, he actually does order the expulsion of Lombards who are manifest usurers, also cohorsans, not just in his royal domains around Paris, but actually, and people directly under his royal protection, but actually everywhere in his realm. And it gets enforced, albeit briefly. Louis IX dies soon after, so the enforcement wanes. But what we're seeing is religious scruple. Usury itself is not a secular crime, but it is a sin for Christians. And we shouldn't overlook the practical determinants as well in terms of like what he can actually manage to do in terms of controlling usury. But essentially for the moral health of the realm, it only matters that Louis himself is not implicated in profiting from usury because of, again, increasing sense of the Jews, of the king's role as protector of the Jews as the king's serf, and the idea that foreigners are only on French soil due to royal permission, and therefore they fall under the same idea. So that's where we get the crystallization, excitingly, in the next period, right after his death, within 5 years, in 1274, we get the Council of Lyon, where essentially, as Rowan shows us, you get a transfer directly from Louis's secular law into canon law. Yes, the wording is not exactly the same, but man, it's awfully close. There is quite a bit of debate about the particular form that usury prohibition should take, depending on different perspectives. So you end up with two new laws, both of which borrow a certain amount of logic and language from Louis's legislation. First, so there's two laws, one of which is related to older laws on usury, but adds a few new twists. First, there shouldn't be any church burial for manifest usurers, and their wills are invalid unless they make restitution. So what we're seeing is there should be both a spiritual and secular penalty for usurers. And the second is that no one is to rent property to foreign usurers, and instead they are to expel them from within their lands and never allow new ones to come in. And it is the second one that's very close to the language of Louis's 1269 decree, and close in spirit as well. Canon lawyers, who are already there's a huge industry of them already, see that this is very clearly aimed only at Christian usurers, which makes sense. It is church legislation. The other thing that is happening here, and this is not unusual in some of the canon law that develops in this period, it's canon law, but it requires secular action to work, right? The church doesn't really have, it can have no church burial for manifest usurers, but it doesn't have the wherewithal to prevent the rental of property to foreign usurers or to expel them. Okay, so that's sort of this very brief period of crystallization, movement from secular law to canon law, and then we have sort of the aftermath. And there are two aftermaths. There's an aftermath in Christian knowledge, and there's an aftermath in practical activity about what to do with these usurers. So, in the Christian knowledge, there is a huge mechanism that develops for disseminating the activities of councils and papal rescripts in this period. In fact, we're looking sort of at the height of this. So this gets disseminated much more quickly than almost all the other canon councils. But dissemination of medieval law is also only happens in specific contexts. And here, there's the amazing work of Rowan in tracing the medieval sources that show how this gets disseminated. And because we're nearing the peak of the building of the main foundational texts of canon law, this very quickly gets put into the main canon law collection and into the university curriculum of canon law. As Rowan points out, this means that if you are a student and you are going to lectures in canon law, you're probably likely to retain at least a couple of things. The idea of not renting to usurers, and also not burying usurers, and also that foreign usurers are to be expelled, which is a much harsher penalty than most other sins, so tells you about the gravity of the sin. It also, you might have gotten, depending on the quality of your instruction, some possible reasoning for foreign usurers to be expelled, because of course that's also the process of putting canon law into the academic curriculum at this point, is commentating and explaining the sources and reasoning. And the main reason that it takes a while to come up with, it's not a lot of great sources, is that it's not just that this is sinning and it's a sin that's contagious because other people can be contaminated by the sin of a usurer, but foreign usurers drain local wealth elsewhere, right? They're foreigners. So if they're not making restitution, the money is going, well, mostly to Italy. But as Rowan points out, this doesn't say very much about general knowledge. Different versions of this circulate in local bishoprics. It gets rewritten when it gets disseminated to lower clergy as actionable edict. Mostly it doesn't get disseminated to lower clergy and population as active laws of their parishes or dioceses. The main way that he can trace that it gets disseminated into popular consciousness, if it does, is in manuals for confessors, which do have a broad circulation. And it does, and probably the two pieces of prescriptive advice that you might get are don't rent properties to usurers, and the sin of usury is contagious. But, and it's very much in the canon law, in the confessor's manuals, but people don't read the whole confessor's manual. It's only if it happens to come up that you like go to your index and find usury. So, but for hundreds of years, this notion probably exists to some extent in the popular consciousness. But the other thing that Rowan points out is because it gets very full treatment in the legal corpus, the whole set of canons, even if they mostly actually, in most of Europe, nothing happens with these, they're there to be used if and when the issue of usury and the issue of Jews arises again. So the other aspect is the practical. There is a spate of activity in the next 30 years, but again, even though these are canons of the general church, it's mostly localized to the exact same area where the original expulsions and concerns happened. That is Northwest France and England. And there are now very clear expulsions of foreign usurers, Lombards, with somewhat different timings and trajectories and consequences in England and France. And the other thing that happens is despite the absence of Jews in the canons, and canon lawyers' very clear understanding that Jews are not concerned, the general understanding outside the high circles of canon law is that usury is sinful, no one should rent to usurers should be banished from the lands, and that pretty much immediately extends to Jews in almost everyone's mind, whether they're ecclesiastics or lay people. And what we see is, it's not within the next 30 years, we also see the Jewish expulsions from English royal territories in Western France, followed in 1290 by expulsion from England, and expulsion from France in 1306. Elsewhere, these ecclesiastical provisions almost never become part of ecclesiastical law. The expulsion in particular, Rowan finds in like 1 out of 50 of these collections. Restrictions on renting to usurers, which might seem a little bit more common, is more common, but still it's only 1 of 15 pieces. So what we could say is that usury in general is simply not actually particular significant sin for most of those who are engaged in pastoral care in most of Western Europe. There are occasional eager readers of law or confessors who push out a statement or policy, but they tend not to get implemented. And the other thing that happens is that, again, a lot of precedent is based on the personality of a particular pope or a particular king, And the English kings, and especially the French king Philip IV, who expelled the Lombards and the Jews, are really not examples of Christian kingship that most other kings or rulers would be wanting to follow. And that helps make it mostly, it's kind of a dead letter, as in it's accepted, but there's no interest in it. And then what we see is that there is a resurgence in the 15th century. There is a new context of that comes out of waves of English violence around the Black Death, waves of anti-Jewish violence around the with repeated outbreaks of the Black Death. We should remember the Black Death does not just happen in 1348. And economic contraction, increased velocity of wealth transfers, which leads to renewed concern with economic sins, usury, in areas with long established traditions of lending. Also, many more universities with expanded teachings of this primary legal corpus, but also much more nationalized discourses as more national universities get established, which means that in certain places, some of this discourse leads to much more vehement anti-usury discourse, but in other cases, it leads to expulsions of Jews with the tools that are already to hand. As Rowan points out at the end, the Spanish example has a very different logic that comes out of the establishment of the secular Inquisition, anxieties about the realities of conversion and social mixing, but he does note, when it comes to Aragon, which is much less like the rest of Spain and much more like southern France, the logic of the claim to usury actually does get applied again. So again, it's there to be used. So, I have gone on too long in giving a summary of this. So I'm just going to, and I had two big things I want to talk about, but I may just limit it to one. I do want to say that one of the great strengths is that Rowan is not oversimplifying the intellectual complexity of thinking about expulsion and its justification. And he really gives us this sort of interesting set of related impulses and constellation of ideas that arise in very specific circumstances, but get taken into these nets of increasingly wide European cultures and then get deployed pretty selectively in new contexts. But I do want to bring up one thing that Rowan probably rightfully did not talk about, except for to bring it up a lot. So I suspect he's not going to be surprised that I want to talk about the knotty question of crusade and its vexed relationship with money and taxation. And I kind of hope that his next book will be about this secretly. That is, Rowan points out many times that the impulses of rulers to cleanse their territories of usury is very connected with crusading vows. And I don't think that's at all random. And I want to say two things about this. And here, Rowan needs to correct me if my knowledge is out of date. Some of this is my training that is now in the deep and distant past. But one of the things that's important in my training in economic history, especially in the work of Chris Wickham in tracing some of the history of this, but also in the comparative work of Laurent and Wang in thinking about the Europe's experience, economic experience as a fiscal state in the vast Eurasian context, is that Western Europe is completely exceptional in the Middle Ages in that its rulers not only lack an agrarian tax base, they lack a legitimate claim to one. That is, from the third millennium of Western Eurasian history on, and I know this because I get to teach it, governments had taxation regimes based primarily on agrarian production, the main source of wealth. Now, for both practical and legal reasons, this falls apart in the very late Roman Empire, although at very different times and to very different extents, but it's no mistake that it falls apart pretty much earliest and most thoroughly in England and Northwest France. Now, and Rowan, of course, points out at various times in his book how very poor the kings of both France and England are in comparison to everyone around them, including individual moneylenders in their realms and especially including any even mid-sized Italian city-state. It's shocking. And this is indeed because they don't have a tax base, and there is the logic of both of their realms is that kings are supposed to live and run their administrations off of their own personal royal domains. But crucially, this is how we come back to crusade. What makes general taxation begin to appear again is the Crusades, beginning in particular with the Third Crusade, but even more under Innocent III, with his various and multifarious crusading enterprises. This is the basis of the legal, or sorry, the ideological basis for papal taxation in particular, but also takes the form of the Saladin tax in England with the raising of the Third Crusade. The ramifications of this is that there is a deep connection between legitimate raising of money in the form of taxation and spiritual benefits. And this happens in two ways. The extraordinary needs of defending the Holy Land, mostly recapturing Jerusalem after its loss to Saladin in 1187, require more money to support fighting men. And listen, after the First Crusade, nobody is raising 3 years of income throughout Western Europe to go and crusade. You need some funding. But also, the other thing is, ultimately fighting men that they want to go to crusade, and crusade has spiritual benefits. And Innocent III, in his very logical thinking mind, thinks, those benefits should not be reserved only for those with the physical abilities to contribute to the fight. You should be able to get spiritual benefits from contributing any way you can. Chiefly, that is, with some money for the people who are going to go fight. It is also a hope to prevent this recurrent problem of crusade, which is that all sorts of people who are not fighting go along because they love going with an army. But also, this is also, as any good medievalist will tell you, the basis of the problem of indulgences. So this makes raising money a particularly fraught issue, right, of spiritual benefits and dangers, and helps explain why Louis IX is so friggin' concerned with his financial purity, and that of his realm around the crusade. And finally, just on that subject, Rowan rightly rejects the idea for lack of concrete evidence, saying that there's no legal precedent that relates crusade to the idea of expulsion. But there certainly is a very recent actual precedent for expulsion that meant a great deal to English and French royals and nobles who were deeply invested in crusading. That is the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from the city of Jerusalem. It's the first real expulsion that we see carried out by Europeans. And we should also say it also comes from a literal Old Testament example of the cleansing of the land of Israel of the non-Israelite people as part of the Exodus story, which gets referred to in these crusade narratives that are very popular. So, but I might also recall when we talk about the lack of legal precedent that various medieval legal conferences I've gone to also talk about the general lack of crusade material in the canon law, and that's in part because canon lawyers often kind of hate the crusade, not the practice of the crusading, but the fact that it just has the worst legal basis and reasoning. It just doesn't have any. So it's not surprising that there is a very clear precedent, but no one's talking about it in the canon law material. Okay, I was going to give you a whole discussion of the economic circumstances of England and France that make this a particular fraught issue for them, but I've gone on too long. So I'm going to turn it over to my colleague.
You don't respond. I don't know what you had. It's just going to be a colorful to your to your presentation and discussion. Well, I should start by saying that there are three kinds of books worth reading. There are the book there are the book where you learn something, and then there are books where not only you learn something, but books which give you a chance to think about things that you have never even considered. Also, rethink your what you thought were your well-established opinion, open doors to new aspects, new perspectives, and I think that Rowan's book is one of these. And I don't say that as a form of sugarcoating or captatio benevolentiae. I intend to prove it. And how does he do it? Yes. Well, it looks very simple at the beginning. It picks up two words, two concepts, and you say, oh wow, yeah, that's easy. One is expulsion, and the other one is usury. And when you look at them, you say, oh yeah, expulsion, I know, people, and then usury, people have written about it, for quite a while and so on. So yeah, oh, that's familiar. Okay, let's look. But then the thing it does with these two words is, beyond at least my limited or maybe my imaginations. Yeah. Suddenly, it opens up all sorts of combinations. You have kings and you have popes, council, bishop, Lombard, Carosin, usurer, crusaders, all sorts of economic transactions, yeah. And he combined all these things, yeah, and he put them into a coherence because there is such a diverse, approach initially that you think, oh well, it's going to be a difficult ride, yeah. We are going to going from one point to the other. No. In the end, it's all presented in a very coherent and convincing demonstration. And so, how does he do it? He does it first by, and I want to emphasize this, by a very solid methodology. Yes. And then also, of course, he does it also by a very substantial demonstration. So on the methodology, I want to mention 3 points. Yes, it's first then the use of the sources, yes, which are amazing when you look at the scope of the archival research and manuscripts and printed books from the 11th century to the 16th century, and different sources too in theology, law, and also royal legislation and historical perspective and sources. Yes. And what for me was also is here very interesting is that it's not unusual when people summon so many sources that in a conscious or unconscious way, sometimes they end up hiding behind the sources. They want, so to speak, to impress us, or like in this classic form of discovery in American law, when one party provide all sorts of documents for the other party. Yeah? But Rowan doesn't attempt to bury us under the sources. Yeah? He keeps in control. Yes, and he uses them when he has to, and in always very good connection. So that's, I think, the first point at the level of the sources. Yes. The second point, as I had already mentioned, is that he is familiar with legal sources, with theology sources, and also with historical sources. And this is a combination which is also very unusual and that I want to underscore. Yes. And the third point about the sources is that it's also royal legislation, practice, canon law, all sorts of synodal statutes, so that there is also a great diversity in this method, and which enable him then to really keep in control of it and then use it for his demonstrations. On the substance itself, yeah, I like to make 4 points. Yes, and the first one is then on the concept of expulsion. Yes. what does expulsion means in this context, and what do we see in the story that he presents us in his demonstration. And I don't want to put, in his mouth words that he has not used, so I caveat in this sense. I'm not going to hide behind this book, although that would be very tempting. It's then first the aspect of the relationship to space. Yes. It's interesting to see, and Jessica mentioned that with the Crusades, yes, but to see that this expulsion occurred, and at the time also what Rowan called the invention of expulsion, in this mid 12th century, at a time also where the English king and the French king are also expanding their domain, yes, and where also the Crusades is also about, new space, expanding things. So we have this interesting relationship to space, yes, and I'm going to, probably to follow only one single argument, which will be, I will repeat on different points, and maybe in all honesty, I have to mention it before, is that I see also a cultural shift, which is very important than in this process that Rowan describes, which has to do with the emergence of a legal culture. What I mean by the emergence of the legal culture, it's a process which is very well known, yes. But usually we focus on the teaching of Roman law, the teaching of canon law, there is new royal legislation, and so on. But what is behind it, yes? What is behind it is the use of some concepts. Because in this sense also what the medieval people do is that they are going to use law as a language, yes. And that's, of course, a fundamental role of the law, not only in terms of communicating, but also in redefining their relationship to the outside, the relationship to the void, and to the other people in legal terms. And I think that what we are seeing here, for instance, is the relationship to space. Initially, with this expulsion, what we see is that the king is exercising his power, yes, on this place that he claims as his place because he's from there. Yes. But that creates a problem when now he's expanding his territory. He's moving into territories where he's not from. Yeah. And in this feudal structure, where of course family connections were important, that is, you could claim, okay, I was not born here, but my grandfather was born here, or something like that. Yeah. But this works for a while, and then after that it doesn't. Yeah. So that we see then the progressive shift from this kind of idea of domain to a legal concept, which is the concept of territory. Yes. And I would like to remind you, maybe you know, but, and I'm not making this up, it's already in Roman law, in this title of the digest about the meaning of words. Yeah. There is one comment about what is a territory. Yes. Where does it come from? Well, the etymology of territory is terra, yes. And the Roman jurists say the territory is the place where the magistrates exercise his terra meaning power, yes. And so we see also happening here a new attitude and relationship to space, which is going to have also, as I will come to that later, have an impact also on how people living in this space are being defined and are being seen. Yes. So that, I think, is one aspect. The second aspect that we see also that we witness in this process of expulsion, from, let's say, this exercise of power to what is going to be the practice to the practice of power, to an exercise of a right. Yes. Initially, and you can see that, for instance, in this just initial justification, xenophobia in the case of England, yes, and the power to kick people I don't like or I don't want to see, yes, and then the theologian reason with the King of France, which is also here as serves not as something which is relatively vague at that time, and it is not important at that time to define it with precision, because it's not really about who the people are and what they are doing. It's about what the king can do and is doing. Yes, so that we have comparison with today. I mean, we see, for instance, how then in our use of the concept of aliens, we are very often denying people their identity. It doesn't matter who they are. What is important is that we can push them out, yeah, because that's this issue of exercising the power, yes. And initially, that's what's happening, it seems to me, in England and in France, is that what is more important is not what happened to the people themselves and who they really are. What happened is that I can exercise my power when I want, yes. But things get more complicated when then space becomes now, one as justifies this new space and saying that's a space where I exercise my power. That's a territory. Then now it gets more complicated because then I have the right to be there and to do things. And then as soon as you claim that you have right to do something, then you need to describe and the things with more precision. Yes. And one other aspect also, which is starting also to come up then at the end of the 12th century in this context, related to the relationship between power and space. I mentioned the idea, the concept of territory. The other is the concept of jurisdiction. Yes, which still also is not only now lawmaking. Yeah, when I was reading Rowan's book, I was very surprised by the number of royal edict and legislation and declaration which pile up. Yeah, so that's also the a production, so to speak, a production of legal documents, yeah, which correspond to this idea of jurisdiction there, which is to speak the law, yeah, juris dicere initially, yes, and where then now the king is the lawmaker, yes, and so that the expulsion of the Lombard chaos and of the Jews is also now not only the expression of the political power on the domain, but it's also the moment in which the king is making laws. Yes, and so that's one very interesting aspect, I think, that Rowan is describing and analyzing in the book here. The second aspect is then, and I come to that, I've mentioned the person, is the foreigners, yes, and the things, and it's interesting, for instance, as it's an also interesting moment in the way how, and I was mentioning law as a language, in the way then people are going to express their perception of the other, yeah, in this context. And Rowan mentioned quite correctly, yes, the Council of Lyon in 1274 and Usurarum Voraginem, yes, which use this very strange vocabulary, yes. And I've been curious and I tried to find out, where it was in the source, the word aliegenus, yeah, instead of, for instance, the usual word of the Lombards, the Chaosin, yes. Now it's aliegenus, or people who are not from here, yeah. And that's it, yes. There are only 14 occurrences in the Decretum of Gratians, yes. And almost all of them, with the exception of two very old pontifical decretals from Pelagius and Stephanus, come from Ambrose, Augustine, yeah, the father of the church. So it's not a legal concept initially, yes. And it's interesting to see how it's being used in the council. So of course there seems for me two explanations. The obvious one, I would say, is that of course the church has a universal jurisdiction. Yeah? So it cannot really select or focus on one category of people coming from one area. Yeah, like Lombardia, it made sense for the King of France to talk about the Lombard because it's outside France. Yeah, but for the church, everyone is in. There is no one out. Yes, Well, the role is going precisely to kick some out, but you don't kick them out of the territory. You kick them out of this indefinite space. Yeah. So therefore, in this context, the use of words like Carosine and Lombard doesn't make sense. But it seems to me that there is also another reason which is happening here, and another part also of this change in the legal culture that we see also, as I mentioned today. So the comparison with today is interesting. Is that these people are no longer viewed in terms of their own identity. They are denied their identity. They are now legal categories. Yeah. Before, when you say a Lombard, then you think, well, there is a history associated with the person. Yes. Just like if you would say today, a Mexican or Venezuelan or a Haitian coming then to the US border. Yes, they're behind, it's their identities, their history, their past. When you use the word aliens, yes, you put all these people in the legal category. And it's much easier to deal with because now you can play with the legal concepts, yes. But at the same time, yeah, you deny people who they really are. Yeah, now they become legal pawn on the construction of a legal system. And attitude will be different in this context, yes. And that's, of course, then brings me to the third point, is the word that also Rowan used and placed in such an interesting perspective in this relationship with expulsion, is the word usury, yes. And we see in the story that Rowan gives us, we see then this progressive change also in the understanding of what usury is, and mostly also in the use of the term. Yes. We are moving from, let's say, vague, as I say, also theological concept. Yes. Which is in fact initially defined by the people. Yeah. What I mean by that is, what is usury? Usury is what the Lombard and the Carosine are doing. Yes. So it's their practice, which then help people pinpoint what usury is in their process of expulsion. Yes. In naming it, so to speak, they name it by what these people are doing, and this is what they are doing, which is not acceptable. Yeah. And slowly you see a change here, and I think I would like here, I'm really pushing maybe the envelope, but I like the idea. I might be wrong, but I like it anyway. So is that also how usury is going now to be used differently? We are going to see the use of the word usurer. Yes. And usurer is a legal category which is now going to be applied more, for instance, to the Jews. Yes. And the Lombard and the Carosine also now are the usurer. So it's under a legal term once again. And I think for me here, I see a change in the attitude, or in the practice of the expulsion, of the repression. Yes, which is now also, as I say, there was the alien, and now there is a usurer. Yes, so that usury now takes central stage as something that people are going to use to define other people. While I see it, I mean, I apologize for this very simplistic, always binary argumentation, too familiar to the lawyer, unfortunately, is not always so simple. I understand. Yeah, I know. But then that's before it was, let's say, the people who were at the center stage. And now it's going to be the practice, and the practice is going to be used as a legal category, yes, to define the people, yes, and at the same time, that's why also it's going to be expanded. That's how then it can be expanded not only to the actors but also to the beneficiaries. Yeah. you notice also that if I just as a real side remark, so how also in some of these sanctions there is still a reference to the space, yeah. When, for instance, they cannot be buried on sacred ground, yeah. I mean that's all an issue of space, the space that the church control, and then you are placed also in your death outside this space. But that's a little side effect. So what we see, in fact, if I could say like that, what I see for me is that we are moving to a certain level of abstraction, which is going to make the repression more effective, because it's going then to reach a larger group, yes, which is not going to be only defined by their, let's say, geographical origin, for instance, yes. And that's also it seems to me, so this abstraction is going also to be used to make, for instance, the repression against Jews also more effective in this context. Yes, it's not only the theological or the vague dimension, which then people, of course, have in the mind too, but it's also this legal category. A type of practice legally defined, which is going to be applied to this group, yes, and then it can be also through this category that these groups are going to be repressed and exposed. Yeah. So in this model of representation, I think it is something which is interesting. And so that's, in conclusion, my fourth comment on what I had the chance to go through some of the doors that Rowan has opened for us. Yeah, is then this increasing use of the law and the legal categories, yeah, which is also going to, of course, have an influence on the perception of the power, on the role of the king, but it's going also to change, it seems to me, because words are not neutral, and especially when canonists and civilists use them, yes, is going also to make the process of repression of usury more effective. And as you have noticed, I have in my presentation progressively moved from the word expulsion to the word repression, yes, which is also not neutral in this context. But that means, in my opinion, that's what also now then express a certain new nature, essence of the royal power and the perception of the subjects, of the people who are there. Because there is also something interesting, that the people who are expelled, yeah, are not expelled from the law. Yes, they are not outlaws. Yeah, it's because they are in the law that they are getting this particular treatment, so to speak. Yeah? So what was then this form of, let's say, physical expulsion, yeah, now becomes more and more also a form of punishment. Yes, a punishment in the sense of development of a more repressive society at that time, which goes together hand in hand with the emergence of what will be the early modern state. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity of exploring things that I had not considered before. Thank you.
I'll be brief because I know people are mostly excited to sort of just drink and eat. And I do want to leave a couple of time for, I know some people have actually already read the book, and I want to give time in case they have any questions. First, of course, it's wonderful to be here with lots of colleagues and students, and in the presence of two people from whom I've learned over many years a great deal. I first began admiring and learning from Jessica as a starting graduate student, and although our trajectories have been somewhat sort of inverse, where I started as an economics historian and Mediterranean, and you started doing canon law, and then we sort of switched. But I continued learning for so long. And Professor Mayali, in fact, when I was an undergraduate, so even before I knew about Jessica's work, I developed an interest in medieval law, and my senior thesis advisor suggested that if I wanted to go to graduate school, I might consider studying with you. I then took a class in medieval law, failed the final exam, and went back to economic history. And so the book The fact that I ended up doing sort of law in this book sort of reflects sort of a long sort of circuitous effort, and in fact gets back to one of the things that Professor Mayali brought up, which is the degree to which, and actually, and Professor Goldberg brought up at the very beginning of her comments as well, which is the fact that the reason that law ends up playing an important role in this book is I like to think for a very honest reason. It's not because I went looking at the beginning to find law. I went looking for something else entirely. I was looking as an economic historian. I was interested in definitions of foreignness. I was interested in the movements of those who got expelled. I was interested in the construction of royal authority, the hardening of boundaries. All of that, mostly from a sort of economic perspective, somewhat from political perspective. What I kept up running up against was the importance of law and discourses of legality in discussing expulsion. It came again and again. And I realized that one of the things that I think had hampered a lot of discussions of Jewish expulsions was the fact there was a tendency to dismiss all of that as window dressing, to treat it as sort of not substantive, not substantively important. And sort of just, of course we find this, of course, we describe them as sort of lawbreakers and the usuries against the law and they're doing this. And that to me seemed unsatisfactory to not sort of wonder, well, of all the possible implications, and this in fact gets to Professor Goldberg's comment with the Crusades, because indeed, as my student here who took my Crusades class will well remember, the expulsion of Jews and Muslims from Jerusalem is a very important event. It does loom large in the consciousness. There are other biblical models of the expulsion of enemy populations from territories. So then why is it when rulers begin expelling Jews that they never invoke that imagery? They never invoke those arguments. The arguments they invoke are all around usury. And that's one of the things that struck me, that in a world of possible arguments to justify exclusion and removal, why wouldn't one choose sort of those sorts of arguments, those ready things that are experienced? Why would they instead seize upon usury? What made this a particularly powerful force? And the effort to explain that ended up sort of resulting in this book. One of the strange things about writing a book is that then people talk about it and then you want to go and write it again in the way that sort of you would have written it had you had all these ideas sort of in time. But I will drop sort of, I do want to say space. Is there one slide? Can you pull up on the slides quickly? Just because we mentioned space, I wanted to bring up just an image, this image here, which was actually one of the key spatial images that prompted the rewriting of this book, in a sense, because this book began as a study of the expulsion of Christian usurers, with sort of Jews sort of looming at the margins, because I thought, well, they've already been studied enough and I had nothing new to say. And then I created this map, which was looking at the expulsions of Christian usurers and the expulsions of Jewish usurers from 1200 to 1350. And that is it for expulsions of Jews. And there's nothing beyond the map. That is the space in which Jews are expelled in Western Europe before the Black Death. And there's also sort of the sum total of spaces in which Christian users are expelled. And I thought these spaces matter. This overlap matters. This can't be clear coincidence. And the result was that unfortunately, this meant that instead of being part of the vanguard of medieval historians who have been moving away from France and England, I became part of the group of medieval historians who are back writing about France and England, which was never my intention because I began as an Italianist. And it also meant that instead of being part of the sort of appropriate current of Jewish studies scholars who are sort of moving away from the lacrimose history, here I am writing a book all about expulsions. And so this book in some ways is the book that I never set out to write, because it didn't reflect any of the things that I sort of believed were sort of important in a scholarly way to begin, and didn't reflect who I thought I was as a scholar when I began this book. But in a sense, of sort of Montaigne, this, I think, as a result, is an honest book, because it reflects the things that I found in going through the sources, and the only way that I could make sense of a story that I never set out to tell. I don't want to say too much more because there's so many things to say here, and I do want to leave some time for discussion, but hopefully that at least engage with some of the themes that came up already in the conversation. But I'm happy to welcome other questions. Yes.
So two things that stuck out in the book is that there was a time when you mentioned that there were particular efforts to constrain interest rates at a certain level, and I think the level you mentioned was something like 37%. I thought even our credit cards don't charge that. And the other thing is the episodic nature. I'm not talking about the from above organized repressions, but the episodes that seem to come sometimes from below. And I wonder if, I mean, what can be said about any correlation between either the level of interest rates that were being charged or the debt burden on the community at the time when you suddenly, because this all has like resonance in modern history, you know, that everybody likes banks until they have too much debt, and then all of a sudden the bank is the bad guy.
So among the things that aren't in this book is that I did sort of run tests, for instance, and look at the frequency of expulsions across famines, across sort of known periods of economic crisis, and like there's no correlation, like nothing comes up. And that was something, I mean, again, when I started off, I thought that the natural explanation will be that you have expulsions at times of economic crisis, but you don't, you have expulsions at times of royal fiscal crunch. And those two things, in fact, do not actually map on sort of as tidily as one might think, because the sorts of things that produce royal fiscal crunches are not, in fact, indebted peasantry, because the kings, as Jessica already sort of brought up, in fact, don't actually get as much wealth as one would think from their agrarian territories. They're already constrained. It's when you have spent a great deal of money on other things, like going on crusade, like sending your son on crusade, like trying to sort of to buy kingdoms for your son, sort of so on and so forth. Those, and echostatically, those sorts of things prompt sort of political crises. And in the same way that sort of, thinking to Amartya Sen showed that sort of famines are always also sort of political crises, not actual sort of shortage of grain. These expulsions around usury are never the result of an actual sort of shortage of credit or complaints about that. They are results of sort of political contestation that lead in the short term to these expulsions. But that, of course, doesn't explain why expulsion came to be thought of in the first place, because, of course, there's many other things one can do to moneylenders you don't like. Squeeze them for money, seize all their sort of wealth, throw them in prison, and kings certainly do that. But they also begin deciding that expulsion is an appropriate penalty. And what really shocked me was that when you look at the kings who expel moneylenders and cite usury as justification, they generally don't profit from it. The kings who expel people conventionally as usurers, who don't give a public explanation for it, profit from it. So when Philip the Fair expels Jews in 1306, he issues no justification, and he seizes all the Jews' wealth. But when Edward I expels Jews from the kingdom, and as well as from his territories in Gascony, he either gives the wealth to the church or he allows the Jews to take their movable property with them. And so the kings who actually talk about usury are make a concrete effort to not profit from that usury themselves. Whereas the kings who are sort of having cash crunches, they often don't mention usury explicitly, and they instead expect sort of the usurers to pay up. And that again shocked me, because again, there's this question of, these words matter. The public meaning of these phrases clearly has resonance in ways that don't apply, or that we don't see if we simply sort of look at all the expulsions altogether and don't actually sort of think about the semantic power of these expulsion orders that are much more finely constructed than I think we've tended to see them in the past. That was a very long answer. I apologize. Any other questions? Jesse.
No, I have to say, actually, just this last answer you gave is really interesting to think about that. And I think to bring it back to the point about crusades and crusading, which inevitably I would ask about, right? But like Edward is like a very earnest crusader, right? He goes once and he always wants to and hopes to be able to go again, right? Louis as well. I mean, par excellence. And it's really interesting to hear you say that they don't take the money and they don't publicize. Whereas Philip the Fair, then let's get the Templars as well and take all their stuff, right? So it's like a totally different model. So yeah, that's just kind of really interesting to hear that, and fitting it into these ideas about sort of purifying within and this kind of program without, or
and just an aside of this is far from law, but of all the things that Philip the Fair throws at the Templars, despite their long association with banking, despite the fact that they get hit with usury accusations elsewhere, Philip the Fair does not accuse the Templars of usury, because he's confiscating their money. So again, these sorts of rhetorics that I think have often been framed as sort of purely discursive or sort of or belonging just to a register of sort of stock, almost meaningless anti-Semitic tropes, I think in fact do carry a great deal of weight. The boundaries between sort of political life and personal piety, even for kings like Philip IV, who sort of engages all sorts of things that we now look back at, are much more delicate than I think sometimes we remember.
And again, the thing that I was most struck by is you think about all of the anti-Jewish rhetoric and violence and almost, and all of the other accusations, which are much more powerful in terms of sparking popular protest and violence, none of them get mentioned, right? Which is kind of shocking.
Right, the discourses of popular violence against Jews and the discourse of royal expulsions are very separate.
Yeah.
We do have a question from Tom Barton. Can you talk a little bit about why you think Spain is different?
So as Tom knows, I spent 3 months in the archives in Barcelona, looking for evidence to sort of connect the dots, thinking that this must also be present in Barcelona. There must be a rhetoric of expulsion. There are expulsions of foreign merchants in Barcelona. In fact, this project began as an investigation of expulsions of foreign merchants from Barcelona, and then mutated beyond any recognition in Barcelona. It doesn't even get mentioned. But it comes late. But it's only in 1402 that usury gets mentioned. Before that, the foreigners are simply expelled with no mention of usury. So usury is a late element there. I've tried to figure out why for a long time usury doesn't seem to matter. I think it's partly because moneylending is important enough to both Christians and Jews at all levels of society in the 13th century that usury never takes on the bogeyman fear that it has elsewhere in Europe. And by the time that it does, the Jews aren't even particularly involved in major ways in moneylending in Spain. So in Aragon, by the late 14th century, new forms of credit have emerged that have church permission, that the Jews are no longer sort of specifically associated with moneylending as a major population. But it is one of the things that I've wondered about, and I've looked through the Spanish Citadel evidence, I've looked through the archival evidence, I tried to find sort of more resonance of the usury expulsion connection. And in some ways, maybe it sort of simply shows of the degree to which we do need to pay attention to these rhetorics, because it clearly had no purchase in Castile. It clearly just didn't mean anything. And an expulsion order for the Jews from Spain that goes on for like 5 pages of the expulsion edict from Castile, they just don't mention usury amidst all of the things they accuse Jews of doing. And so again, but as Jessica already brought up, in Aragon they do, and that was one of those manna from heaven moments where I was trying to figure out how do I end this book. And my colleague Aaron Rodriguez said, you have to talk about 1492 in your book, because you can't write a book about Jewish expulsions and not mention 1492. And I'm like, but Aaron, as we all know, nobody mentions usury in 1492. And then I found the Aragonese expulsion order that nobody has looked at except for 3 people, one of them in Hebrew, and nobody's looked at it. And it talks about usury and my canon. And that was like literally the last month. It was even after Fiona had read a draft of this book to go to the press. And it was literally like sort of like God coming down and like, Rowan, I will give you your conclusion. Here you go. But I have no idea why it's so rare. And Spain, Spanish exceptions was a thing. Maybe this is one more thing. But because it even penetrates into Germany, it penetrates into northern Italy.
Yeah. So the economic part of the argument that I was going to make is, again, Spain actually fits the pattern of everywhere that's not northern France and England, right? As you point out, until the 15th century, right? This is like received but not implemented canon law, because, and I would say it's not resonant because it's resonant not only, it's a particular nexus of not only is there a lot of royal power, but there is very little urbanization and the financial networks that develop with it everywhere else, right? These are among the least they have these 2 big cities which create their own problems, partially because they're not part of an urban network that has developed all of this financial apparatus and comfort with that, or a sense of it being a necessary evil. And certainly Aragon falls into that. But as you point out, there is a whole new wave of concern around usury within those communities when there's finally this massive economic contraction in the 15th century.
And I
And
guess
that might be where I would
and maybe
say it fits in.
one addendum that might be also that in the 15th century, when the canon does take on new meaning, when there are cities that are pushing the expulsion of Jews pursuant to canon law, it's sort of been revived. It's precisely the moment when in Iberia there's a much more powerful discourse for segregation and exclusion, which is the fears of kind of contagion and contamination from conversos. So right at the moment when it does take on meaning in Italy and it takes on meaning in Germany, Spain's already worked out something that is a much more powerful argument than just complaining about usury. It is new, it is more frightening, it is more intense. Whereas all the Germans and Italians have is canon law. I don't know.
Well, I have a question that's not what you're wanting to work on here, because you're working on the law and the explanations for it. But I'm just curious, what happened to the people who were expelled? And is this when they end up in Moravia and Bohemia and Poland? Do they get that far? Do they move very far away? Do you have any idea?
So I was tracking a lot of the movements of individuals the best I could, and the results were sort of desultory, because I could find an individual here and I could find a different individual there, and I could very rarely sort of connect the dots. Also, the naming stock occasionally is sort of unfortunately limited. One of the things that struck me though, actually maybe I have a map here.
So these are expulsions of individuals more than whole.
Well, we do it groups as well, but they often choose and go one more forward. Let me see if it's going to be, and next one, maybe next one. Yes, okay. So this map here, it doesn't break down temporally, but you can actually, this is Christian, these are just Lombards, these aren't Jews. But you can see this density here, right?
Yeah.
And that's the boundaries of the medieval kingdom of France. That's the boundaries of French royal authority. And in fact, most of these dots actually vanish after Louis IX. And so what ends up happening is that in fact all these moneylenders move to just outside the boundaries of effective royal authority and into Burgundy, the Low Countries. But they often are clustered right along the boundaries. They still have access to sort of to continue lending to communities, but the king cannot reach them. And when I first sort of put that map up, it was, I mean, the French documentation is very good for this period. We just don't have Lombards there and Lombards settling. It was a sort of stunning delineation of, that is in fact the boundaries of French royal authority, right there, very visibly based on where these Christian Lombards flee to. In the case of the Jews, it gets much more complicated because in these ways, most move either into Catalonia or northern Italy or the Rhineland, and then they move from Germany down to northern Italy in many cases after those expulsions. The great push eastward happens at the very end of the period of the book.
1200s.
So it's like 1450s, 60s, 70s that we start to really get large scale immigration. That seems a fair.
Yeah, and of course, the vast majority of post-Spanish expulsion is into the Islamic world.
Right.
Yes. Hi, I'm a student from law school and I really have very limited knowledge on the European history, but I was kind of intrigued by the topic because I've done a very little bit research on the history of moneylender in China, where I originally come from. So I think one very interesting point in the Chinese history is that under the kind of legal culture of financial repression, where the government monopolizes all the financial supply, so there's very limited living survival room for the private money lenders. But from time to time, because the very strong social demand for the financial resources, so there's a kind of compromise between the government and what they call underground finance suppliers. And so these underground financial suppliers still acting as the money lenders and become usurers, but the government just turned a kind of blind eye to them. So I was really curious about, like, in the 12th century Europe, so what's the situation of the social demand for the money? Kind of, do private entities need money, and for these money lenders, foreign money lenders, do they really supply these demands for those local entities, and what's kind of that situation impact the legal rhetorics of expulsion and other regulation?
The brief answer is one of the reasons that many of these expulsions prove temporary is precisely because people end up desperately needing moneylenders to come back. It happens with Jews, it happens with Christian moneylenders, and it's a reminder that in fact the forces that are driving the expulsions are not popular protests. Most of the evidence we have is in fact when these communities leave, that local communities say no, because everyone still needs credit and now it just becomes more expensive. And so there are certainly moments when there's anti-Jewish violence, for instance, where there's sort of nominally anger around sort of debts, but most of that tends to be sort of incited by very powerful figures who are individually already sort of very indebted. It's not sort of broad-based kind of debtor classes that are sort of rising up to do this. It tends to be sort of middling upper elites who sort of orchestrate this violence. And in the Black Death, for instance, we find the same thing. So but there's general need for credit, it's widespread, and then in different areas we get variegated responses. Jews sometimes specialize in one community with Lombards in another, sometimes they both address sort of the same community of need, and then sometimes you have Jews in one city and Lombards in a neighboring city, and they don't overlap. So it ends up being remarkably varied in terms of who's lending to who, and at what levels and when. There's enormous variation over the period. We have these images of sort of late Middle Ages of Jews lending to the poor, and in some cases Lombards lending to the rich, because Lombards do become bankers as sort of dukes and princes and popes. But that is not at all what's happening in earlier periods. It's not at all what's happening in German cities. There's much more variation. So, but the world of credit is something that is so interesting, and these professional lenders only account for part of it, partly because they're charging 43%, which means if you're going to them, it means that you haven't been able to go to somebody else who is going to give you an informal loan for something more reasonable. These are the people you go to when you sort of need to turn to the professionals, as it were, because you don't have those networks. And if I can end with sort of one last mea culpa, going back to Professor Mayali's comments about space. I almost stopped writing this book several years ago. I was about to give it up because I realized the book that I needed to write at the time, or so I thought, was actually a spatial history of expulsion in sort of the pre-modern world, looking at various spaces from sort of individual sites, from cities, from regions, from countries, and think about how that changes from sort of the 5th century to the 15th. And I gathered all this evidence for that when I had my junior fellowship with Harvard Society of Fellows. And then someone convinced me that I could write that book in the future, but I'd already written enough of this one and maybe I should finish this. So I hope that book, when it gets written, will do a better job answering your questions than this one did.
Well, thanks so much. Join me.